online live stream church service. I have one announcement this morning. Okay, we have a limited number of the world's finest chocolate bars left. And if you want to purchase some for $1 a piece, please email the church office to make arrangements. They make great Valentine's Day presents. Thank you. In this anxious time, let us reflect on our capacity to feel with those who suffer. Let us imagine hands reaching out into empty space. Where is our beloved community? Where are those who will always take us in? Where are those who will help us heal? Spirit of life and love, allow our egos to sink in exchange for a rising understanding of grace. Put your body back on the table. It's cutting out the thing potentially in the big box. Break us open to the grace of unconditional love. Show us the ways we can connect. Allow our compassion to flow like water. And for our chalice lighting this morning, life-sustaining community. We light our chalice today to awaken to the calling within us, to devote our being to a community where all are. Let this flame represent the burning desire to build a life-sustaining community, a community where love prevails from the work we have done to make it so. And now, covenant, if you will join me in repeating the covenant. Love is a doctrine of this church. The quest for truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. And now for our congregational singing, we will have Tom Sheehan singing Immortal Love, and that is number 10 in your hymn book. now we foxes from ancient stories.
Good morning. Our story today is called Sister Goose and the Foxes by Faye
Now we
Loganson. Sister Goose swam in the pond
questions about
happy
my
as could
sound.
be. Now and
From
then,
ancient stories.
she ducked her head down to nibble a little bit here and a little bit there. She took no more than her fill of those succulent underwater plants, for she knew that the pond belonged to everyone. Meanwhile, Brother Fox was hiding in the willows, and at the far end of the pond, he didn't like to see anyone happy, least of all a goose. Sister Goose swam along, enjoying the clear blue sky and the bright sunshine. She swam along to the willows growing at the far end of the pond. All of a sudden, Brother Fox sprang out of those willows, shouting, "Trespasser, you get off my lake!"
Today, it has
Sister
changed.
Goose shrugged up her wings and looked at Brother Fox, mystified. "Trespasser? How so? This lake does not belong to you. It belongs to us all." Brother Fox didn't seem to hear her. He carried on. "You've been eating some of the plants in this pond. They don't belong to you. If you don't get out of this lake, I'm going to take you to court." Sister Goose was truly perplexed. She knew she hadn't done anything wrong, but she could see by the ugly gleam in Brother Fox's eyes that she wouldn't be able to convince him. Instead, she said, "I'm not afraid to go to court over this. At least there, justice will be served." And they went to court. But when Sister Goose arrived at the courthouse, she was very surprised. The clerks who sat just outside the door were both foxes. Inside the courtroom, she saw that the lawyers were foxes, and the judge was a fox, and even the jurors, though some of them had red fur and some of them had brown fur and some of them had silver fur, they were all foxes too. Sister Goose was quaking as she entered the defendant's booth. Sure enough, though her arguments were sound, the judge and the jury found her guilty. And they convicted her and turned her into stew. That is how it goes. There isn't much justice for the likes of a goose when the folks in the courthouse are all foxes. Ancient stories for modern times.
Invite you into a moment of yes. Before we start our prayer, I would like to introduce the anthem, which is "It Is Well With My Soul" by Dara Belikova, arranged by Dara Belikova, played by our own Bonnie Rowe. And now I would like to invite you into a time of meditation, contemplation, and prayer. It has been a very anxious time, very anxious, and a lot of us are feeling overwhelmed. But I have this prayer by Erica A. Hewitt that I have adapted for today. You, mercy without end, are the sea of tenderness that holds us all, grieving alongside us in our moments of hurt. Hold me, gentle me, keep me afloat. When I see pain outside of myself, make me brave enough to move towards it, that I might lighten another person's burden. Because the only way through is together. Amen. We will have a moment of silence. And now for our reflection song, number 123, Spirit of Life.
Spirit of life, come to me, sing in my heart all the strength of compassion. Blow with the wind, rise in the sea, move with the hand, giving life the shape of justice. Rose, holy rose, wings set me free. Spirit of life, come to me, come to me.
And now for our reflection song, Spirit of Life. I have this reading this morning by Erica A. Hewitt. What do we do with our pain? It begins with the quote by Richard Rohr. If we don't find a way to transform our pain, we will always transmit it to those around us or turn it against ourselves. If your religion is not teaching you how to recognize, hold, and transform suffering, it is junk religion. On a New York City subway, passengers sit. In the foreground, a man cradles his face in one hand. People are in pain all around us. all the time. How can we be companions to those in pain and bear witness so that the pain can be transformed into something less harmful? Last week, the crowd on a New York City subway herded me into a corner against someone's seat. A man in his 20s with red eyes, his face etched with grief. When I'm around people in pain, sometimes the energy of their sadness rolls over me like an invisible ocean wave. If I remain passive, its force can knock me down. So as the subway rumbled uptown, I tightened my grip on the bar overhead, closed my eyes, and held the stranger in loving kindness. As I breathed in, I imagined absorbing the thick, oily smoke of his pain. I visualized the great, glorious tenderness as a cloud of light above us at ground level. Each time I breathed out, I imagined myself as a conduit, drawing that love down toward us and pulling it around the stranger. I matched his pain, breath for breath. The subway screeched to a halt at my stop, and as my eyes flew open, they landed on the stranger who was using his sweater to wipe tears off his cheek. Our eyes met. Before I could look away, he offered a half smile. I smiled back. Buddhists will recognize what I did as a practice called Tonglen. But if you were to call it prayer, I wouldn't argue with you. One of my friends often wonders out loud whether it's ethical to pray for someone without their consent. But I've weathered through rough patches where I felt myself flailing, sinking, in need of all the ways, from concrete assistance to the mystical transmission of love, that others might hold me up. You want to share your hope with me? I'll take it. Pain is going to visit all of us. You, me, the guy on the subway, sporadically but unrelentingly, as long as life lasts. Ultimately, I believe there's one thing as common and as powerful as pain: our capacity to be companions to one another. Both our genetic material and our holy spark compel us to reach for one another as partners in hope and fellow meaning makers, to help one another transform pain into something holdable. My sermon today is called Pandemics, Mystics, and Change. This is a new year, a time of reflection and hoping for well-being. It is a time where we look at the past year in consideration of our intentions. Let's face it, this past year has been challenging, to say the least. However, the pandemic of 2020 refrains to abide by the Gregorian calendar. It is still with us. There is hope on the horizon for a future resolution. As more people are getting vaccinated, we can foresee a time when we will worship together in person. Until then, it is important to do all you can do to risk to reduce the risk of contagion to yourself and the people with whom you are connected. With this hope of future resolution in mind, let's consider the 2020 pandemic. What caused it, and what have we learned? I asked some of you 2 questions in reflecting on lessons from the pandemic. What caused it, and what did you learn? The number of folks who participated in this survey does not constitute a representative sample of the congregation. What that means is that the answers lack any capacity to be generalizable to all Toledo Unitarians. So it would be inaccurate to use these responses to say that this is what all Toledo Unitarians think about the pandemic. Most of the Toledo Unitarians who responded said that the cause of the pandemic was a virus, that there was animal to human transmission of the virus. The animal identified was a bat. Some said that the cause was climate change, the interdependent web, human disregard for the balance of nature. Also, responses included unsanitary conditions, unhealthy behaviors, economic disruption, and poverty. Reading the generous responses from you about lessons you learned, what stands out is your desire to appreciate your spouses and family and friends, recognizing the need for more self-discipline and patience. You also made comments about staying home, the need to slow down, relax, as well as stress, suffering, and anxiety. From your responses, lessons included concerns about inequitable relationships between organizations and institutions, essential workers, poor and marginalized communities. You spoke about the need for more moral education, citing the need for empathy and compassion, science education, and how people make decisions based on referencing the group to which they are a member. Here, I want to be sure to note the whole perspective of this response. The decision people make precludes a lack of intelligence. People are not stupid. They look to their group for what they say and do likewise. You also responded that there is a need for good governance, while also responding that you learned about your need to create and grow spiritual practices. I have to say that I'm surprised that no one mentioned learning how to use technology, including Zoom and more varieties of video conferencing to stay connected. Community is one of the most important parts of what Unitarian Universalism offers. Perhaps since I asked these questions using social media, it was a foregone conclusion. This was not a social scientific study, however, but Pew Research in October 2020 did conduct a survey of Americans thinking about the pandemic. I want to share their results, which can be used to characterize American public opinion. The Pew Research Center for Religion and Public Life published the results of a survey entitled, "What Lessons Do Americans See for Humanity in the Pandemic?" According to the survey, about 86% of Americans said that there were lessons to be learned from the pandemic. 35% believe the lesson is from God, while 37% say the lesson was not from God. 13% said they do not believe in God. 13% said there was no lesson, and 1% did not answer. The study found that people learned lessons from God about society, their priorities, government and politics, as well as practical lessons. Lessons people said they learned were from God included the preciousness of life, being humble, and taking people urgently express that science be prioritized over bipartisan politics. Practical lessons people learned included cleanliness, wearing masks, hand washing, better anticipation of crisis, and listening to the experts. So what though? Have we learned to recognize, hold, and transform our pain or our fears? Lessons imply that we know something. Even more, lessons imply that we are informed with next steps, what we need to do. Has the cause of the pandemic helped you transform your suffering? Humanity has been through pandemics before. In 1918, there were lessons about staying away from each other and wearing masks and issues with nations communicating clearly with each other. Even then, nations had a hard time being open to one another about a virus that was going to arrive on their shores, on the shores of their country, our collective blue boat home, Earth. Calling the 1918 influenza pandemic the Spanish flu is indicative of the pandemic started in, some people say started in Asia. Some people are saying it started in Kansas. I've got a couple of different resources here, but either way, my point is there was a fear about blowing it out of proportion. And that's what led to the silence about it in Europe. And 50 million people worldwide died. Now, that's a small number in comparison to the over 400 million people, 400,000 people, 400,000 people and counting who have died just in the United States from the coronavirus. So there's a little bit of a mistake there, but still, just in the United States, we've had over 400,000 people and counting. We're almost at the 500,000 mark. It feels like. We, and I mean humanity, have missed the mark on this. Even though public health experts had the information about COVID-19, government officials said they did not want to make a big deal of it. So there was no national plan to deal with it. That's my point. We didn't make a national plan. We don't want to make a big deal out of it. So we turned away from each other, stayed in our place due to what? Defined roles, sovereign territories, or a perception that power is a game of win or lose? Is morality a game? 400,000 people, some of whom you know, some who will die alone, suffering of skin deprivation because this virus is too contagious to have their loved ones with them to hold their hand. Still, there was another even earlier pandemic in the 14th century. Humanity was suffering with a variant of the bubonic plague. The Christian crusades in Western Europe had decimated part of the population, while the Ottoman Empire in Eastern Europe killed many Eastern Orthodox Christians. The European economy was in decline, food was in low supply. Consequently, people had a low resistance to this variant of the bubonic plague. When they looked to the cause of the plague, they felt compelled to blame themselves or collective sin or scapegoat. Whose fault is it? While we are on the mission of fault finding, what degree of maturity do we have to recognize our role in the process? But does fault finding help us recognize and hold suffering? Does causality help us transform pain? There is a point to knowing the cause because we have a vaccine, and for this we are grateful. However, having a vaccine and having leadership to equitably distribute it are two different things. It will also not return to us our loved ones or ease our grief for them. We are still suffering. We may not be at our best, especially when we are so anxious. We have a tendency to blame people for how we feel or distance ourselves from who or what we believe is at fault. Much of this suffering is rooted in how we first learn how to feel and manage our emotions. And this is still true even now, even in this pandemic. If your religion does not help you recognize, hold, or transform your suffering, maybe it is time to discard it. I think that religious mystics teach us how to identify, hold, and change our pain. How do we manage our emotions? In the 14th century, there was Julian of Norwich, an empathic Christian or Christian mystic. There is a whole group of Unitarian Universalist mystics who ground themselves in science. And I'm so excited to know about this group. Julian of Norwich was not a person of low wealth, yet she was open to feel with people who were suffering at that time. To feel with is what empathy means. She wrote a manuscript, The Divine Revelations of Love, to teach people by sharing her introspective experiences or visions of God, Jesus, and Mary. In her writing, she assured people that God was not angry and love was his meaning. All will be well, and all will be well. We could learn to be introspective, embrace humility, and open ourselves to seeing the suffering of the world. If we could ground this process in the science of our time, if we could be curious and open to engage creativity and support each other, maybe we can shift and transform this chaos. Perhaps we could transform our suffering, our need to blame and distance ourselves, and transform our pain. How could you put away your fears to see the whole larger system and your part in it? What could you do to be less anxious while recognizing, holding, and transforming pain. In Unitarian Universalism, none of us gets to abdicate this responsibility to one leader. Our faith ancestor, James Luther Adams, said that we are all called. We are all called to side with the poor and the oppressed. Empathy is a scientific fact. What one of us has never encountered cruelty, pain, or suffering? If you can feel it, you must deal with it. I am confident that we are called to this kind of mysticism. But you can read about it if that prepares you to change. There are writers like Margaret J. Wheatley or Rupert Sheldrake who talk about leading systemically and the science behind the spiritual practices like meditation or singing or listening to someone speak. There are also people who are leading the change. One person alone may have an idea, but in community, we are stronger. We can choose to assist each other through this time. We choose to associate with each other, with Unitarian Universalists at large, because it eases our suffering. Our ability to connect with each other might just be grace. Let us go forward together to transform our pain and suffering. Let us be the change and never again take one step back. Amen. Blessed be Ashe. Now is the time for our offering. If you see the link in the chat, the YouTube channel, I'm sure Mickey is typing away. Go ahead and feel free to click on that link and give to this generous congregation, this community, your community, our community. And we will appreciate your gifts. Coming soon. Next week's 10 a.m. Spiritual Adventures Forum is Presidential History by Ron Randall. And next week's 11 a.m. service, Gateways to Joy by Judy Troutman. And of course, immediately after today's service, there's a social hour. And we have a special invitation to any visitors who are watching this. So please feel free to join us. I have these closing words. Grace received. In this anxious time of waiting, we feel with those who suffer. We answer the hand reaching out to us in new ways. We are beloved community. We are becoming the people who will always embrace the many. We are becoming the people who help each other all heal. For we know love is a circle with no bounds. All are embraced by this grace. And now we will send the flame that sustains community. Now that we are awakened to our calling, let our actions be devotions that welcome all with love into this community. As this flame is extinguished, it is sent with you to keep your divine spark alive. It is our task, yours and mine, to kindle the flame in each other, to sustain a growing community where love prevails.